Section 17 of Kazan by James Oliver Curwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leonard Wilson. Chapter 17. His Son. It happened that Kazan was to remember three things above all others. He could never quite forget his old days in the traces, though they were growing more shadowy and indistinct in his memory as the summers and the winters passed. Like a dream there came to him a memory of the time he had gone down to civilization. Like dreams were the visions that rose before him now and then of the face of the first woman, and of the faces of masters who, to him, had lived ages ago. And never would he quite forget the fire, and his fights with man and beast, and his long chases in the moonlight. But two things were always with him as if they had been but yesterday, rising clear and unforgettable above all others, like the two stars in the north that never lost their brilliance. One was woman. The other was the terrible fight of that night on the top of the Sun Rock, when the lynx had blinded forever his wild mate, Gray Wolf. Certain events remain indelibly fixed in the minds of men, and so, in a not very different way, they remain in the minds of beasts. It takes neither brain nor reason to measure the depths of sorrow or of happiness. And Kazan, in his unreasoning way, knew that contentment and peace, a full stomach, and caresses and kind words instead of blows had come to him through woman, and that comradeship in the wilderness, faith, loyalty, and devotion were a part of Gray Wolf. The third unforgettable thing was about to occur in the home they had found for themselves under the swamp windfall during the days of cold and famine. They had left the swamp over a month before, when it was smothered deep in snow. On the day they returned to it, the sun was shining warmly in the first glorious days of spring warmth. Everywhere, big and small, there were the rushing torrents of melting snows and the crackle of crumbling ice, the dying cries of thawing rock and earth and tree, and each night for many nights past the cold pale glow of the aurora borealis had crept farther and farther toward the pole in fading glory. So early as this, the poplar buds had begun to swell, and the air was filled with the sweet odor of balsam, spruce, and cedar. Where there had been famine and death and stillness 6 weeks before, Kazan and Gray Wolf now stood at the edge of the swamp and breathed the earthy smells of spring and listened to the sounds of life. Over their heads a pair of newly mated moose birds fluttered and scolded at them. A big jay sat pluming himself in the sunshine. Farther in they heard the crack of a stick broken under a heavy hoof. From the ridge behind them they caught the raw scent of a mother bear, busy pulling down the tender poplar buds for her 6-weeks-old cubs, born while she was still deep in her winter sleep. In the warmth of the sun and the sweetness of the air there breathed to Gray Wolf the mystery of matehood and of motherhood. She whined softly and rubbed her blind face against Kazan. For days, in her way, she tried to tell him. More than ever she wanted to curl herself up in that warm, dry nest under the windfall. She had no desire to hunt. The crack of the dry stick under a cloven hoof and the warm scent of the she-bear and her cubs roused none of the old instincts in her. She wanted to curl herself up in the old windfall and wait. And she tried hard to make Kazan understand her desire. Now that the snow was gone, they found that a narrow creek lay between them and the knoll on which the windfall was situated. Gray Wolf picked up her ears at the tumult of the little torrent. Since the day of the fire, when Kazan and she had saved themselves on the sandbar, she had ceased to have the inherent wolf horror of water. She followed fearlessly, even eagerly, behind Kazan as he sought a place where they could ford the rushing little stream. On the other side Kazan could see the big windfall. Gray Wolf could smell it, and she whined joyously, with her blind face turned toward it. 100 yards up the stream a big cedar had fallen over it, and Kazan began to cross. For a moment Gray Wolf hesitated, and then followed. Side by side they trotted to the windfall. With their heads and shoulders in the dark opening to their nest, they scented the air long and cautiously. Then they entered. Kazan heard Gray Wolf as she flung herself down on the dry floor of the snug cavern. She was panting, not from exhaustion, but because she was filled with a sensation of contentment and happiness. In the darkness Kazan's own jaws fell apart. He, too, was glad to get back to their old home. He went to Gray Wolf, and, panting still harder, she licked his face. It had but one meaning, and Kazan understood. For a moment he lay down beside her, listening, and eyeing the opening to their nest. Then he began to sniff about the log walls. He was close to the opening when a sudden fresh scent came to him, and he grew rigid and his bristles stood up. The scent was followed by a whimpering, babyish chatter. A porcupine entered the opening and proceeded to advance in its foolish fashion, still chattering in that babyish way that has made its life inviolable at the hands of man. Kazan had heard that sound before, and like all other beasts had learned to ignore the presence of the innocuous creature that made it. But just now he did not stop to consider that what he saw was a porcupine, and that at his first snarl the good-humored little creature would waddle away as fast as it could, still chattering baby talk to itself. His first reasoning was that it was a live thing invading the home to which Gray Wolf and he had just returned. A day later, or perhaps an hour later, he would have driven it back with a growl. Now he leaped upon it. A wild chattering intermingled with pig-like squeaks, and then a rising staccato of howls followed the attack. Gray Wolf sprang to the opening. The porcupine was rolled up in a 1,000-spiked ball a dozen feet away, and she could hear Kazan tearing about in the throes of the direst agony that can befall a beast of the forests. His face and nose were a mat of quills. For a few moments he rolled and dug in the wet mold and earth, pawing madly at the things that pierced his flesh. Then he set off, like all dogs will who have come into contact with the friendly porcupine, and raced again and again around the windfall, howling at every jump. Gray Wolf took the matter coolly. It is possible that at times there are moments of humor in the lives of animals. If so, she saw this one. She scented the porcupine, and she knew that Kazan was full of quills. As there was nothing to do and nothing to fight, she sat back on her haunches and waited, pricking up her ears every time Kazan passed her in his mad circuit around the windfall. At his 4th or 5th heat the porcupine smoothed itself down a little, and continuing the interrupted thread of its chatter, waddled to a nearby poplar, climbed it, and began to gnaw the tender bark from a limb. At last Kazan halted before Gray Wolf. The first agony of 100 little needles piercing his flesh had deadened into a steady burning pain. Gray Wolf went over to him and investigated him cautiously. With her teeth she seized the ends of 2 or 3 of the quills and pulled them out. Kazan was very much dog now. He gave a yelp and whimpered as Gray Wolf jerked out a second bunch of quills. Then he flattened himself on his belly, stretched out his forelegs, closed his eyes, and without any other sound except an occasional yelp of pain, allowed Gray Wolf to go on with the operation. Fortunately he had escaped getting any of the quills in his mouth and tongue, but his nose and jaws were soon red with blood. For an hour Gray Wolf kept faithfully at her task, and by the end of that time had succeeded in pulling out most of the quills. A few still remained, too short and too deeply embedded for her to extract with her teeth. After this Kazan went down to the creek and buried his burning muzzle in the cold water. This gave him some relief, but only for a short time. The quills that remained worked their way deeper and deeper into his flesh like living things. Nose and lips began to swell. Blood and saliva dripped from his mouth, and his eyes grew red. 2 hours after Gray Wolf had retired to her nest under the windfall, a quill had completely pierced his lip and began to prick his tongue. In desperation, Kazan chewed viciously upon a piece of wood. This broke and crumpled the quill, and destroyed its power to do further harm. Nature had told him the one thing to do to save himself. Most of that day he spent in gnawing at wood and crunching mouthfuls of earth and mold between his jaws. In this way the barb-toothed points of the quills were dulled and broken as they came through. At dusk he crawled under the windfall, and Gray Wolf gently licked his muzzle with her soft, cool tongue. Frequently during the night Kazan went to the creek and found relief in its ice-cold water. The next day he had what the forest people call porcupine mumps. His face was swollen until Gray Wolf would have laughed if she had been human and not blind. His chops bulged like cushions. His eyes were mere slits. When he went out into the day he blinked, for he could see scarcely better than his sightless mate. But the pain was mostly gone. The night that followed he began to think of hunting, and the next morning, before it was yet dawn, he brought a rabbit into their den. A few hours later he would have brought a spruce partridge to Gray Wolf, but just as he was about to spring upon his feathered prey, the soft chatter of a porcupine a few yards away brought him to a sudden stop. Few things could make Kazan drop his tail, but that inane and incoherent prattle of the little spiked beast sent him off at double quick, with his tail between his legs. As man abhors and evades the creeping serpent, so Kazan would hereafter evade this little creature of the forests that never in animal history has been known to lose its good humor or pick a quarrel. 2 weeks of lengthening days, of increasing warmth, of sunshine and hunting, followed Kazan's adventure with the porcupine. The last of the snow went rapidly. Out of the earth began to spring tips of green. The bakneesh vine glistened redder each day. The poplar buds began to split, and in the sunniest spots, between the rocks of the ridges, the little white snowflowers began to give a final proof that spring had come. For the first of those 2 weeks Gray Wolf hunted frequently with Kazan. They did not go far. The swamp was alive with small game, and each day or night they killed fresh meat. After the first week Gray Wolf hunted less. Then came the soft and balmy night, glorious in the radiance of a full spring moon, when she refused to leave the windfall. Kazan did not urge her. Instinct made him understand, and he did not go far from the windfall that night in his hunt. When he returned he brought a rabbit. Came then the night when, from the darkest corner of the windfall, Gray Wolf warned him back with a low snarl. He stood in the opening, a rabbit between his jaws. He took no offense at the snarl, but stood for a moment gazing into the gloom where Gray Wolf had hidden herself. Then he dropped the rabbit and lay down squarely in the opening. After a little he rose restlessly and went outside, but he did not leave the windfall. It was day when he re-entered. He sniffed, as he had sniffed once before a long time ago, between the boulders at the top of the Sun-Rock. That which was in the air was no longer a mystery to him. He came nearer, and Gray Wolf did not snarl. She whined coaxingly as he touched her. Then his muzzle found something else. It was soft and warm, and made a queer little sniffling sound. There was a responsive whine in his throat, and in the darkness came the quick, soft caress of Gray Wolf's tongue. Kazan returned to the sunshine and stretched himself out before the door of the windfall. His jaws dropped open, for he was filled with a strange contentment. End of Chapter 17 of Kazan by James Oliver Curwood. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio.